Salutations, greetings in whatever day or time, location you are right now. And I would like to say, let's be here together now, but that's one thing that we can't be. To be here on YouTube is to have me be talking at one time and have you be listening not only somewhere else, but at another time. That's what I want to talk about, is this question of the rise of asynchronous kinds of communication. It's as if communication itself in the digital age, in order to compensate for the radical extension in space, has had to go asynchronous. Otherwise, there would just be too many demands upon a given individual. But what that means is the culture itself is rapidly changing. It's rapidly, quickly changing from within. Now, the way that I think one could see this, and there's different ways of coming at it, but Alfred Schutz gives certainly very good direction when he has a concept called growing older together. Growing older together in its optimal state would be co-presence in immediate dialogue with one another in a face-to-face interaction, where you have the full rich tapestry of interaction, and it's sort of like the richest ontogenetic coupling, if you want to use Maturana and Varela's concepts. But this notion here of being present with one another in a simultaneous growing older together, that itself is very different than these kinds of asynchronous forms of interaction. Now, I guess you're growing older with me in a way that I'm not growing older with you. That is, you, as you're watching this, you're somehow growing older with me, but I'm not really present anymore. You're interacting with a piece of my past. And so in that sense, we've already drifted off. Now, if you take cultures, okay, if you have a culture and that culture travels along, that culture is going to change and it's going to be subject to variation. But because the culture stays together and simultaneous with itself, the changes go relatively unnoticed. Now, there might be some sort of cultural drift that could be apparent, but if there's good cohesion in people staying simultaneous to one another, that change will go not only unnoticed, but it will be a slow rate of change, because there will be everyone else sticking together to sort of like in a viscous way drag down the change. But what happens when the group breaks off and now the two groups sort of go independently and they're in their change? Not only will those two groups now become radically different than one another because they've been separated off in an asynchronous way, but they will accelerate in their rate of change. That is, asynchronous communication accelerates the rate of change in the communication patterns and in the culture itself. I think right now we're facing some very odd times of knowledge distribution here in the culture. So there's one sense, I guess we could say, that here I am participating in a proliferation of asynchronous communication, which will rapidly change the culture. And by that I mean in very localized pockets. Only people who have access to internet, high speed probably. I mean, you're not going to be able to run this on various kinds of computers, but I do think that the more that people want to get at what are some of the key issues in the changes of culture that are going on right now, you want to look at the rise of email. Now, you could say, for example, that books were always asynchronous, and that newspapers, I mean, there are forms of asynchronous communication, and there are electronic synchronous communication. Perhaps the Super Bowl, that might be given as the exemplar of synchronous communication today, where people at least share time and a kind of mass collective growing older together. We can all, across the country, you can hear in different neighborhoods, you can hear people cheer and yell hooray all at a simultaneous moment. So there still will be cultural events that will bring people together in a simultaneous growing older together. But the more rapidly knowledge can be distributed widely, see, I mean, I think book culture does have asynchronicity as its model as well, but it doesn't have the quick, instantaneous distribution methods of the electronic media. And so there is a promise of a kind of, more simultaneity. That is, there's less temporal drag. It's like I'm speaking to someone who can watch this just 10 minutes from now across the world. This was radically impossible with book culture, even though book culture, book culture is to sort of to fall into history, whereas to fall into the internet is to fall into the other. It's to fall into the distant, the radically other in space and time. It's not necessarily historical, although it is of the past. Right now, you're only watching a piece of the past, and I'm now different than what you're watching. But I think the general point is that without recognizing the difference between synchronous and asynchronous kinds of communication, and without recognizing the proliferation of asynchronous forms of communication and asynchronous electric forms. I don't just mean, there's always been books, and books are a kind of admittedly asynchronous communication. Oftentimes, book culture though was done orally in group, and people read things together, and that's what a book. Oftentimes, for people, really only comes to be the book that it is in the community of learners who read that book together and they share their ideas. That's where the learning of the book happens, and this is what I think Schutz is talking about. That sort of growing older together with people. I think YouTube does give a sensibility of that. At least you can grow older with another person, but you can't grow older together. Again, right now, you are admittedly growing older with me, but I'm not growing older with you. I'm already, I've left a while ago. You're just sitting there watching a record. That doesn't mean that there isn't a kind of cultural change and drift. It's just a change that's rapidly accelerating the kinds of change in the culture. If there ever was a time when the culture itself and its belief systems, its overall architecture, the way that people think itself would be subject to radical localized pockets of rapidly changing culture, the time is, I think, right now. This is the place where it's happening, and it's a place where the medium itself is asynchronous, gives a promise of growing older with another. So it does have a sort of unfolding with the other in a way that a book doesn't, right? A book you can read at your own pace. This you can't really speed up or slow down. So there are forms of a one-way synchronizing with another on such a medium, but it is, again, it's very different than any kinds of technologies we have seen thus far. And with that said, please try to think more and shoot a response video on the difference between synchronous and asynchronous communication technologies.